Well, I'm so excited to introduce this next speaker. You know, one of the things I was proud of was being Ed Deason's chief of staff. And part of the duties I got to do then was being on the search committee that hired Ben Sewell. And I remember the day we actually hired him, we weren't even at Elm Springs. We were at the conference room at the Richland Inn because some other organization had been using the conference room that day. And I remember when it came my time to talk to Ben, I said, you know, I'm sure you don't remember this, but I said, remember like the Tip O'Neill thing, when you're dealing with camps, all heritage is local. A lot of them don't see the big picture. What are the SCV going to do about our flagpole here? You know, and there's some legitimacy to that. Of course, the question is, what are you going to do about your flagpole? But Ben, boy, you were what? Executive director 13 years?
13. Yeah.
And went through a lot. I can't say that Ben's like a father figure to me because he's not that much older than me. So he's either like a young uncle or an older brother, but in many ways. And we could probably write a book just the 2 years I was commander and the stuff you and I went through together. And I've told this several times, but I want to tell you because I like it. When Ben would be on the phone with somebody and he really wanted to get him to do something, he goes, well, my boss really wants me to get this done, talking about the commander in chief. And I would just laugh and I would think, well, Ben, you can use that when you want to, but we know who the real boss is, who's actually running the show up here. And Ben and I would talk all the time because I also wanted to know how many applications we were getting in and how things were going to the headquarters. And Ben will talk about this. In some ways, if it hadn't been for Ben's integrity and principle and stubbornness, we wouldn't have the SCV as we know it today. So there were things that he was pressured to do that he fought back on, and really did a lot of big favors through all that. And I don't know that there's anybody that I have higher regard for than our compatriot here, Ben Sewell. So I'll turn it over to him now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Chuck. I'm going to try to go through a number of things. I don't think I'll be able to keep it perfectly in order of time because it doesn't necessarily make sense. But one of the, and to follow up just a little bit on what Chris said, one of the important things to understand is we were a Mississippi corporation due to General McCain, who personally enabled us to buy Elm Springs and all those other nice things. Doing business in Tennessee. And that was one of the things that created the problems that we had later. And I can touch on that in a bit more detail. But after the reorganization, the new Constitution, then we became a Texas corporation and doing business in Tennessee. And one of the things that people I think need to understand is the SCV is a corporation. It's a nonprofit corporation. We have our board of directors is the General Executive Council. And I used to, when I first got here, I was trying to learn the details about a nonprofit corporation. And I'd have members say, well, Mr. Sewell, when's the last time we ever made a profit up there, the SCV? And I said, well, I don't think that's the important part of it. When we want to do something like this museum and like the anything else, potentially any donation that's provided to us, if somebody can get past the standard deduction, then they could deduct that from their taxable income. And each of our camps has tax exempt status as a subordinate under our group exemption number. And one of the problems there that we face is getting people to just simply do the little return each year, which is very, very simple. But the other problem that I endured a lot was camps doing things that weren't, because under the exemption itself, you have to just explain how it is you're going to make money. And a lot of the camps wanted to have raffles, and raffles weren't one of the ways that we make money legally. And they would put it on the internet, and they would send it around. And one of my daily callers almost when I first got there, early 2002, was Heidi Byrish of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which people have talked about before. And And she was convinced that we were anarchists, that we're going to overthrow the U.S. government. And I said, ma'am, we're on different ends of the political spectrum, but you need to understand that many of our members are veterans, and almost all of them, their father or their grandfather were veterans if they weren't, or they have a son or daughter, who served in the military. We're a United States organization that recognizes our veterans and gives them what they are due. But it's what's important, I think, to also understand is that the SCV is a business, particularly the headquarters. And our business there is to provide services to the members in the camps around the country. And when I arrived, it was a kind of an interesting situation. The person who was my predecessor had left employment in April of 2001. And then in September of 2001, I saw an ad in the magazine for the job, and I was needing to change jobs because the company that I was working for was about to be bought or sell themselves to a big corporation out of Atlanta, and they were going to do away with my job as the CFO and just take it over there. But they were trying to hide it from me. And so I asked my wife if she would be willing to move to Tennessee. And I said, why don't you read this ad? She said, well, okay. So she slept on it and said she would. And so I made my application and then got a call at some point in time from Frank Powell, who was on the committee. And Frank, Sandy said, you got a call from the Confederates today. So this man with a really nice Southern accent wants you to call him back. So I did. Made arrangements for my initial interview. And it just so happened that it coincided with taking a golf trip with fellows from my hometown of Kentucky. And we were going to be in Greenville, Alabama, I think, in southern Alabama. And we would go each year to one of the Trent Jones trail courses. And so I got up on Saturday morning, put a suit in the car and drove to Columbia. I found a large bathroom at the hospital. So I had a healthcare background and changed clothes, came over, and got there about 5 to 1 for my 1:30 interview. And about 1 o'clock, a guy came out in a coat and tie and went to his car. And I figured, well, that had to be the previous interviewee. And sure enough, it was. So I went into the office and the door, and I told the guy sitting there, I stuck out my hand. I said, I'm Ben Sewell. And he said, okay. And he didn't shake my hand. And I said, well, I'm here a little early for the 1:30 interview. And he says, you're really early. And in this terrible Yankee accent. And I thought, okay. I said, I'm on vacation. And I said, I took the day off to come up here. And I said, I've got a 300-mile drive back to South Alabama. And so if they want to start early, because there doesn't seem to be enough time for another one, I said, let them know. They said, oh, I'm here. So I said, I'll sit in my car and you can come fetch me. So sure enough, I got to start the interview. And it was very interesting. And I got a lot of questions. And it was Frank Albert Jones was the MOSB representative, and Dr. Pat Hardy from St. Louis was the adjutant in chief. And one of the things I had wondered about, is my nonprofit experience was primarily with my local church that I joined in 1985 when we got reassigned to Texas Little Methodist Church. And they had me counting the money in about 6 months, and then I was finance chairman a year later, and then admin board chairman, et cetera, et cetera. And but I was amazed at what I learned because I'd gotten away from organized religion when I went away to college, and then kind of got back in with married and 2 children and needing to get them some religious training. But I found all these people were angry, and a bunch quit the church when they didn't move the minister. Then a year later, they moved the minister, a bunch more quit. So anyway, I'll shorten this up. One of the questions was, Mr. Sewell, what kind of experience do you have in the SCV? And I said, well, I've been a member for about 23 and a half years. And they said, well, what about at Camp and Division? And I said, very little. But I said, I was a military officer traveling around the country and the world to some extent. And I said, I was a member of the National Large Camp. So I said, I really don't have local camp and division experience. And I said, I guess that's both bad and good. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's bad that I don't have that experience. But I said, it must be good because nobody knows me. Please excuse my language. And I said, I haven't pissed anybody off. Well, I had no idea how prophetic that was. But I quickly found out. I mean, it was a lot worse than any church. And, but anyhow, what I set out to try to do when I got there, I had a lot of business experience and actually had owned a small business. And, but the operation was a mess. And, when I got hired, they said, well, it was in October, and I figured I need to give at least 3 weeks notice to my job. And they said, no, everything's fine. You can just start at the end of December and the beginning of 2002. And, but when I got, so I thought, okay, somebody been there. I thought they'd need me a little sooner. But anyway, I got there. We had the Yankee at the door, and his job was office manager. We had a woman named Cindy Landis that did kind of in-house accounting and that sort of thing like Cindy White does now. And we had somebody in the gift shop and 3 secretaries. And we were weeks and weeks behind in the work. And so I set about trying to, get everybody to, they said, well, you've never been caught up. We can never. I said, sure you can. You're just going to have to work a little bit harder and put a little more effort into it. But what they've done is taken the previous salary that didn't get paid to the guy who left, and we're doling out overtime to everyone, and then telling the commander-in-chief and the lieutenant commander-in-chief and all the GEC that everything was fine, and but it really wasn't, and we were having trouble paying bills, and so I went through the budget, tried to look at things that we might be able to improve, and the biggest line item was the Confederate Veteran magazine, and it got my attention because the second week I was there, I'd gotten a call from Texas, and the previous editor was a fellow named, I think, Jim Vogler. I don't remember if that's the right first name. And then the publisher was a friend of his, but Vogler had moved to Hawaii, where his wife had gotten a new job. And the guy said, oh yeah, we want to come out and see you. And I said, well, I'm exceptionally busy trying to, fix problems. And I said, it's really not convenient for you to, fly to Nashville and then to, drive down here and see me at the headquarters. They said, oh, no. Said, we'll fly up in our plane and land at the Murray Regional Airport. And I thought, whoa, okay. That quickly got my attention. And so then when I saw how much we were paying, it was somewhere between $1 and a nickel and $1.15 a copy for the magazine to be printed. And then we had to pay postage on top of that. And I did a little scouting around. And anyway, it was past the time when the next summer when Ron Wilson came in, and I was trying to get a little bit of emphasis on, how we can save some money. And that one of the ways to do it was with the magazine. And I said, I'd like to bid it out. And so Ron Wilson gave me the okay to do that. Amazingly, when the bids came in, and then we allowed the current publisher to bid, and they suddenly dropped their cost, which was kind of variable. It seemed to change from the issue. They rebid and they dropped 25 cents off theirs. But we ended up changing publishers, and I told Wilson I could guarantee that we would reduce it by at least $100,000 over the course of a year. We'd have 30,000 plus, and our total budget was only about $1 million then. But one of the issues is we have to run the SCV like a business, and we have to. And then what was the single biggest statistic, a piece of information that I could provide the GEC that was meaningful, and it was membership. What is our membership doing at any point in time? And so we had a great database, and they run wonderful, exactly how many members we had each in the SCV as a whole, broken down by current status dues, meaning people that are active, anybody who had paid ahead and anyone who was a life member, and then also the number of real sons. We still had quite a few real sons at the time, less than 50, I think, but, a significant number. And so at the beginning of each month, we could provide that kind of work. And then the first time when the dues year came and it ended, we would lose a large number of people, and they would go into our delinquent database. Some would renew, but we would lose 4,000 or 5,000 members every year, and then gain 2,000 or 3,000 of those back. But the big emphasis seemed to be more on new membership and recruiting. And, I call them the 2 R's, recruiting and retention. But the single most important factor, I believe, for the SCV is to retain the members we have and the new members that we obtain. Now, some number are going to quit. They'll get mad. Perhaps somebody will die. They'll go get sick. But the SCV's membership has to stay very solid and ideally increase a little bit every year. But the real way to do that, or the best way to do it, I believe, is retention. Just doing a better job. Chuck talked about having, good camp meetings, you need programs, you need sometimes a meal, family friendly, and avoid cliques. This room is very familiar to me because when I got here, I'd been a member of the Optimist Club in downtown San Antonio, and they didn't have an Optimist Club within 40 miles. So I joined the Rotary Club here, but I was an outsider, and I was pretty busy at the headquarters, but I'd try to get over here each week for the luncheon. But invariably, I'd get here a minute or two late. All the tables would be filled, and each of the tables was kind of a clique. So I would normally sit at a table by myself with the only black fella in the club who ran the Boys and Girls Club right there on the next corner. We got to be good friends, but eventually I was able to at least do a program, but I eventually found that I didn't have enough time for the Optimist Club or the Rotary Club here in Columbia. They'd also schedule their big fundraiser to interfere with one of the football games in the fall. But I would try to get to Lexington to do. During the question I think at any time is, are we growing? And then and one of the reasons the pressure on people to not be in the SCV or to get grief about the battle flag and our logo has just increased from year to year. I mean, when we were young, those of you who are somewhat old like I am, certainly in the 1960s, everything was about, reunification still, celebrating the centennial and, being part of it. And if you look at the history of our country, Confederates served a great role in the Spanish-American War, ex-Confederates. Their sons and grandsons and great-grandsons fought in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and everything since. And now we have serious problems in our military. And one of the reasons is there, the DEI nonsense that's all over the country. But we have overserved the military since the end of the War for Southern Independence. And it needs to be understood. And that's, I think, part of what we need to promote. One of the other things is, to follow up on what Forrest talked about earlier about your camps and camp histories. We have at the SCV headquarters all the old camp files dating back at least to the 1900s. And they used to be kind of put together in years, but we were able at one point in time to get it all where we have them sorted by camp. And I'm not sure if they're still in the attic of Elm Springs or if they're over in the museum, but if you'd like to go back and look at your camp and over the years and see, you see who was a member, what they did and things like that. And very prominent people in the South have been members If you look at Charlotte, North Carolina, all the Belk family were SCV. Okay, I mean, the best men in the South served our country, and they also, their descendants served in the SCV. And we can still recruit people but we've got to make it where it's palatable for them. And we came through. I used to meet a lot of different people, and we'd have these ones who would like call the headquarters, and they would want to tell you. They'd ask you, well, what are you doing about this? Like you, Mr. Sewell, or what's the headquarters doing? Well, I said, the headquarters is like running the business of the SCV, and the GEC decides where we spend heritage defense money and how we spend it. But are there any Mississippians that were able to okay, just for us, the Mississippi flag fight, you may remember that very well. And the Mississippi officers at the time were doing a really good job. We provided a little bit of funding, but they were doing a great job. And I had one particular guy that used to write me emails constantly and about what are you doing about this Mississippi? It's being left up to the officers in Mississippi, and then we're providing them whatever support they need from headquarters and the national GEC. But he always signed everything Colonel so-and-so, And so I finally, I asked him, I said, give me a call. And I said, I want to talk to you. So I told him, I said, I spent 20 years in the Army some years ago. I said, I've been out quite a while, but I said, what your title? I said, were you in the Army, the Air Force, Marine? He said, no. He said, I'm the colonel, he said, of my reenacting group. And I said, well, what's your SCV camp? Well, I'm not in the SCV. I said, well, then don't call me anymore. Don't send me any more emails. I'm too busy. Okay? Colonel commanding, of the reenactment group. And I'm all for reenacting, but be an SCV member if you're going to call us and ask us what we're doing about this or that or the other. But one of the things that Chris mentioned, and Brian Sharp, I didn't tell you the Yankee that was there at the headquarters when I got here. When I was on my way back to Greenville for my golf trip, my brother called me. His cell phones were in use, and he said, well, how'd it go? And I said, well, I think pretty well. I said, we'll see if they offer me the job. But I said, but if I do, I know the first thing I'm going to do. And he said, what's that? I said, get rid of that Yankee that sat by the door. And he said, how you going to do it? I said, I'll just squeeze him. I'll just make him do some work. So I asked him, I said, what is your, he said, well, I'm in charge of the secretaries. I said, well, Matt, I said, we only have 7 people total. I can manage 6 really easily. So you're going to need to start doing some work and actually provide something useful. And so he left within a couple of months. And because it's easier to run them off than pay them unemployment. And that's been my motto anyway. But Brian Sharp became membership coordinator, and we deal with the headquarters. I say we, I've been gone long enough now, but they still deal with a few recalcitrant people, and they're, and one of the things that I came up with was an acronym. The Army was famous for acronyms, and my acronym, and Chris touched on, was IAMCTY. And we had a lot of people who they wanted to say, I am more Confederate than you. That's at least what they were implying. You're not Confederate enough because, and the answer for many of these people was, we have to get one of those battle flags on a stick, and we have to run it up through their nose into their brain. That's the only way that they can learn how important it is. And, I said, there's sometimes we have to use a different approach to win people over and to get things done that we really want to get done. But one of the things, and other things I went through, and it was interesting with like Ron Wilson, and I had been, like a national at large member for most of my, what was then 25 years in the SCV, and for the reasons earlier, and I later joined a camp in Lexington, Kentucky, which is very close to home, and I went to school and stayed that many years, and I'm now joining a new camp that's forming outside of San Antonio. But the thing about membership is that, and really the people in the camps is you've got to just have that feeling where people enjoy coming and they feel good about bringing their families and making them happy. But the people that do that just, we have fellows who run people off. I used to have Wilson would say to me about the National Large Camp. He said, Ben, the only people in that, he said, are cheapskates and troublemakers. And I said, Ron, that's not true. I said, there's guys like me who are, in the military moving around. There's guys in places where there aren't a camp. And I said, well, no, they don't want to pay camp dues or division dues. That's why they're cheapskates. So at some point in time, we started the membership renewal system. That all of you are familiar with now, I think. And we would send out a thing, and then that people could renew, and then they could also make a voluntary donation if they wanted. And so once we started getting that, I was able to get statistics as to the headquarters camp members who would renew in great numbers, and then I could compile how much money they donated on the side, and then took it to the GEC and said, okay, these are not cheapskates. These are people who are interested in helping us and doing things that we want done, and also showing it by giving us some money. And one of the other things that we would try to understand, and I think probably all of you do, is so many of our members, particularly the ones who would get mad and call headquarters and say, you need to do this, you need to do that. You're not doing this, you're not doing that. And we were doing everything we could, but most of the issues were being handled by the GEC, the Heritage Operations Committee, that sort of thing. But we would try to explain, and our motto essentially was, it's not about us, okay? And it's not about, it's about our ancestors and concept of how important that is. It's everybody, they want to make it about me, and no, it's really not about you. It's about protecting the honor of your ancestors and the reasons they fought. And I think probably most of you know that our enemies use, the war was fought over slavery, and the wonderful Union soldiers freed the slaves, and the evil Confederates were fighting to keep men enslaved and women and children. And that's not true. I mean, the actual statistics show that 92 to 93% of Confederate soldiers came from non-slave owning families. And there were, tens of thousands of Black Confederates. And there's all kinds of good, solid research that shows that many of those veterans, some were slaves that went to service with their master that they'd grown up with as little boys. Others who were pressed into service to get freedom for serving. And then there were some free Blacks that served. And there were tens of thousands who got pensions. And the fellow, I don't know if he's still there, was an archivist in North Carolina, had done an enormous amount of research. But there were many in Tennessee and every other state. But, we have trouble kind of getting the word out, because most of you know that have children and grandchildren. U.S. history is hardly being taught at all now. And what is pretty bad. That they can't even tell you, what happened in the American Revolution. They put these people on the street, you've probably all seen the interviews, ask them a few questions, and they're like complete idiots. And they just haven't, gotten any training to really understand it. And, part of what we have to do is educate people about United States history. And we've got to be able to do it, in a way that's understandable, that's palatable, and, yelling and screaming doesn't do it for us. we've got to be calm, collected, and well educated ourselves to be able to articulate the points that we wish to make. And how am I doing on time, Chuck? Okay. All right.
I'll tell you
Okay. One of the stories that I'll share with you, I've shared with a couple of you, but my own background was being raised in eastern Kentucky and kind of in the northeast part of the Ohio River. And we had a big sign, had a bridge there. It was the only bridge between Cincinnati and Portsmouth, Ohio. But it had a big sign that said, "Welcome to the South, Gateway to the South," as soon as you cross the river. But my mom and dad were from the mountains in a county called Breathitt County. And it later became known as Bloody Breathitt because after the war between the states, then they fought each other from 1870 to virtually to 1941 when we got involved with World War II. And interestingly, Dad was a senior in high school in 1938, and there were 50 homicides in Bloody Breathitt County, but there was only one murder trial. That late. And then finally in World War II, they kind of joined together and fought the Nazis and the Jabs. But in 1954, I was in first grade in Maysville, Kentucky, where I grew up. And I hadn't had my 6th birthday yet, so go to school and we'd have a recess and we'd fight. And we'd play Yankees and Rebels and kind of beat each other up and come back in. And I went home one day the first week and I asked Mother, I said, "Mama," I said, "am I a Yankee or a Rebel?" And she said, "You're a Rebel." And I said, "Well, good. That's what I am at school." And she said, "Honey," she said, "you're a pure Rebel." And I said, "I am?" And she goes, "Yeah." She says, "In Breathitt County, in the mountains," she says, "rebels and their sons and daughters only married those of other rebels and grandsons." And said we had no mixed marriages in Breathitt County. I'm very, very proud to be a pure rebel. But and interestingly, I had contacted General McCain, and I don't know how many of you may have known him or been in when he was around. And he was really special. He'd been a captain in World War II, and then later became adjutant general of the state of Mississippi, and that's how he became a 2-star general as the adjutant general of the state. But he was kind of he had a secretary that helped him. He was also president of the University of Southern Mississippi, and I had contacted him, about joining in March of 1978. We were back in Germany and about to have our first child, so I got hooked up and joined, and then later I read in the magazine about the Military Order of Stars and Bars, and I asked, so I contacted him and I said, "Now, is this something for SCV members who are in the military or served in the military?" He said, "No, it's for people who had officers at ANSA." I said, "Oh, okay," because I didn't really understand that part. And later, General McCain, when he died, I sent $100 to the University of Southern Mississippi, rather than just to recognize him, and then I became like one of their donors because they wouldn't let me go. Dan can probably touch on how the donor stuff works in the end. But the interesting thing was what incredible records he kept. When I got to the headquarters, I looked at the at-large camp files, and I found my grandfather's membership and when he joined, and I found my dad's, and because I used to steal my dad's lapel pin, or borrow it. I didn't steal it. I'd borrow it and wear it to certain events, and because I always considered myself the Sons of Confederate Veterans before I ever was formally in it. But we have a big hill to climb. I mean, some years ago, the SCV created life memberships that you could buy before, when a son or grandson was born. You didn't have to wait till they were 12 years old. And I bought life memberships for both of my grandsons, and who are now 14 and 15. But the problem I've got, and I don't know if any of you have experienced it, I hate to even admit it, but I will, is their mothers are afraid that if they accept it and, do it now and whatever, that they'll never be able to get a job and be blacklisted in our society. And so I'm going to have to completely train them. The one I've got close to me that I can do it, I'm going to start taking him to camp meetings if I can. But otherwise, I've got to wait till they're 18, okay, to give them their memberships and actually activate them. And to me, it's almost impossible to believe that could happen in my own family, but it has. And I can't make my daughter and my daughter-in-law do it, because they'll I don't want to be turned against the grandchildren. But it just gives you an idea, I think, of what we're dealing with to some degree. And maybe some of you have a little better control within your families than I do. I don't know, but sadly I don't. A couple of stories I want to touch on that you might find interesting, and one kind of was alluded to about when they call it the coup, when that took place, and the Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief, Dr. Hodges, was in charge until they had the hearing and then regained control. I was left in place. They appointed a adjutant-in-chief who was different. And Dr. Hodges conducted himself very well, I want to say that. And he allowed me to run the operation. We had bills to pay. Any check that was over $2,000, $2,000 or over, had to require 2 signatures. And the commander-in-chief would normally have signed some in advance so I could conduct business and pay things. And Dr. Hodges extended me that same courtesy and trusted me. But one day I was sitting in the office, and this, in the middle of this thing, 3 or 4 weeks, 2 weeks into it, and I got a call from the First Farmers and Merchants Bank president, and he said, "Mr. Sewell," he says, "if you got some time, I'd like to talk to you." And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Well, I just got in a fax," and he said, of what's purported to be a corporate resolution, and he said where they want to have control. Have you removed from signing checks and then have control of the bank account extended to somebody else? And we had a corporate seal, and still do, as far as I know, and it's the real thing. That's what we put the little gold stickers in and imprint them and then put them on the stickers. And so I went down and one of our members, who I will not name, but he did have a law degree, had taken apparently a chip certificate, run it through the copying machine, and then had cut out the little copying machine seal that looked like the corporate seal, and then drawn up this resolution, and then put that on the bottom. Made a
Mike's phone. We can't hear you, man.
put that on the bottom, and made another copy of the resolution where it looked like it was a real thing with the seal on it. And so I took a look at it, and I said, "That's fraudulent. That's not the seal." And I said, "It looks like it crossed state lines, so it's probably a federal crime." And he said, "Nobody's going to touch anything in the accounts except you." And he said, "Until such time as we have the formal hearing in Murray County." So anyway, we dodged that bullet, and we were able to kind of keep everything together. And then you've heard most of the rest of the story of how things were put back in place and continue to run. But another thing that was interesting to me, and I'm sure Adam has seen it as well, but we change administrations every 2 years, and each commander-in-chief is a little bit different in terms of personality, how they want to do things, and conduct business and that sort of thing. And it's one of the things that's important at headquarters is to have enough flexibility to kind of deal with that. And it's really not, most of the time you're there doing the work and getting it done and overseeing it. And then the GEC usually meets 3 times a year in person, in February at the reunion, and then again in November. And then occasionally there are like telephonic meetings. But there's always important things that you have to bring to the GEC's attention. You know, the executive director, at least in my opinion, when I was serving as that, was not empowered just to make any decision that he or she would want to do and put it into place. But there were many that required discussion and approval by the GEC. But it's also important for the GEC, I think, to understand how important their role is as being the corporate board for this organization, and making sure that sound policy exists in the way we conduct ourselves and do business. Chuck, that's really pretty much covers it. I'm about to need to cough a bunch or something. Okay. All right, let me scan through here and see if I left anything now. Oh, one last thing. Yeah, I'm sure at the camp level you've discovered this as well, but particularly at the national level, we have a lot of members out amongst us, good members, and then there are some who become exceptionally courageous when they're sitting behind a keyboard or writing an email. And I used to get a kick out of that, you know. And Chris told me a story last night when he was first division commander, and I kind of told him one, and I'll just kind of leave it short. But I had a guy leave me a nasty phone message one night when I first got in there, and I was there very late. It was the winter, and I still had to go to the post office, drop the mail off, go home, and he had like written me, or, you know, left a scathing thing about, you know, how I wasn't Confederate enough and blah, blah, this and that and the other. And it just kind of got to me. So I called him and then got his voice. But that was, you know, there was a home phone, his answering device, clearly. And I said, pick up the phone, you cowardly SOB. I want to talk to you. But he never did call me back. He was one of the keyboard commandos, and we still have quite a few, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.